I have always believed that the fastest way to lose your property is to assume everyone else respects your boundaries. That lesson became painfully real the morning I inherited 2,700 acres with 2 beautiful base lakes and discovered more than 100 strangers celebrating on land they had no permission to use. My name is Nathan Brooks, and until 3 weeks earlier I had never expected to own a ranch this large. My uncle had spent his entire life protecting the property, but after he passed away, everything transferred to me through a carefully prepared estate. The paperwork took months, and I did not receive the final recorded deed until the previous afternoon. I imagined my first visit would be quiet. I wanted to walk the shoreline, inspect the fences, and remember the weekends I spent fishing there as a teenager. Instead, I heard loud music long before I reached the entrance. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the gravel road for nearly half a mile. Boat trailers filled every open space. Colorful banners stretched across temporary gates announcing the annual Bass Classic sponsored by the local Homeowners Association. Volunteers wearing matching shirts directed traffic as though they had organized the event there for years. Nobody questioned why I slowly drove through the crowd because they assumed I was another participant. As I reached the first lake, I counted dozens of Bass boats already moving across the water. Families stood on the shoreline cheering while announcers spoke through large speakers about prize money, sponsor giveaways, and the championship weigh-in scheduled for Sunday afternoon. Everything looked professional. Registration tents accepted new teams. Food trucks served breakfast. Children carried fishing rods while photographers captured smiling competitors launching expensive boats into the lake. For a moment I wondered if I had misunderstood the property records. Then I opened the folder resting on the passenger seat and looked once again at the certified deed issued by the county. The legal description clearly included both lakes, every shoreline, every access road, and the surrounding acreage. There was no public recreation easement. There was no recorded community access. The land belonged entirely to me. I parked beside an old oak tree and quietly began taking photographs of everything. Registration tables. Parking areas. Boat ramps. Donation boxes. Event signs. I recorded license plates and captured wide shots showing how every vehicle entered through the private ranch road. I did not interrupt anyone because I wanted facts before opinions. After several minutes, a woman wearing a navy blazer instead of the volunteer shirts walked confidently toward me carrying a clipboard. She introduced herself as Rebecca Hayes, President of the Homeowners Association, and welcomed me to the tournament before asking whether I planned to compete. I smiled politely and told her I had just inherited the ranch. Her expression barely changed. She calmly replied that the lakes had always belonged to the community, and assured me the tournament had been held there every summer for years. I asked one simple question. Who gave the Homeowners Association permission? She looked at me with complete confidence and answered, We have never needed anyone's permission. She turned to greet another group of participants as though the conversation had already ended, but before driving away I noticed something that stopped me cold. Every single truck, trailer, and boat had entered through a ranch gate standing on property that the deed identified as my private entrance, and suddenly I realized the lakes might not be the biggest legal problem waiting beneath the surface. I stayed at the ranch until the tournament registration closed that afternoon, not because I wanted to confront anyone, but because every passing hour revealed another detail I had not expected. The volunteers accepted cash and electronic payments without hesitation, carefully handing every team an official scorecard marked with the Homeowners Association logo. Sponsor banners advertised local businesses that clearly believed the event had every legal right to be there. Families unloaded coolers, children laughed along the shoreline, and professional anglers compared expensive equipment before launching their boats. Nobody acted like they were trespassing because they genuinely believed they were participating in a long-established community tradition. That realization bothered me almost as much as the unauthorized use of my property. Before leaving, I quietly drove the entire perimeter of both lakes and recorded every entrance, every dock, every gravel parking area, and every wooden sign pointing visitors toward the tournament. What surprised me most was that every road eventually connected back to the same private ranch entrance identified in my deed. There was no secondary public access anywhere around the property. As the sun began to set, I drove directly into town and met my attorney, Michael Turner, at his office. He listened without interrupting while I showed him the photographs, the recorded deed, and the event brochure I had picked up from the registration table. Instead of reacting emotionally, he spread everything across his conference table beside a large county property map. After nearly 20 minutes of comparing legal descriptions with tax parcel records, he looked up and asked a question I had not considered. Did anyone actually tell you the lakes belonged to the Homeowners Association, or did they simply act like they did? I thought back to my conversation with Rebecca Hayes. She had never claimed she possessed a deed. She had only said they had never needed permission. Michael nodded slowly before opening the County Geographic Information System. The digital map immediately created a new mystery. The two lakes were shaded with the same color normally used for community recreation areas, yet the parcel identification numbers still matched the deed sitting in front of us. The map and the legal records were telling two completely different stories. Michael printed several copies before calling the county records office. After a brief conversation, he hung up and frowned. The employee confirmed that the official deed still listed private ownership, but she also admitted many neighborhood planning maps showed the lakes as community amenities. Somebody had changed how the property appeared without changing who actually owned it. That was information neither of us expected. Michael leaned back in his chair and quietly said, "This did not happen by accident." Then he opened the original subdivision file available through the county archive. Inside was a reference to an access easement recorded nearly 20 years earlier, but when he requested the supporting document, the system returned an error. The easement existed in the index, yet the actual page could not be found anywhere in the digital archive. He immediately called a licensed surveyor named Ethan Collins and arranged to meet him at the ranch first thing the next morning. Before ending the call, Michael asked one final question that instantly changed how I viewed the entire situation. "When does the championship round begin?" I answered that the final weigh-in was scheduled for Sunday afternoon, only 2 days away. He quietly closed the file, looked directly at me, and said, "Good. If that missing easement page does not say what everyone assumes it says, this tournament may never reach the final cast." By sunrise the next morning, Ethan Collins was already setting up his survey equipment beside the old ranch gate, while tournament volunteers prepared for another full day of competition only a few hundred yards away. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side of the fence, anglers laughed as they launched expensive base boats into the water for the qualifying rounds. On the other side, Ethan quietly uncovered an old brass survey monument buried beneath years of dirt and grass. He cleaned the marker with a small brush before comparing its position to the coordinates stored in modern county records. Michael Turner arrived a few minutes later carrying printed property maps and copies of the subdivision plans we had reviewed the previous evening. None of us spoke much because every measurement mattered more than speculation. Ethan spent nearly 2 hours establishing reference points around the main entrance, the gravel parking lot, the boat launch, and the shoreline where spectators gathered to watch the tournament. When he finally lowered his equipment, he looked directly at me and said, "The property lines are even clearer than I expected." He spread a fresh survey map across the hood of my truck and pointed to the boat ramp first. It stood entirely on private property. The parking lot extended several feet beyond the subdivision boundary. Even the wooden dock used for tournament check-in crossed onto land described in my deed. Every improvement the Homeowners Association relied upon to operate the event had been built outside the land shown on the subdivision plat. That discovery alone was enough to change everything, but Ethan was not finished. He compared the county planning drawings with the legal descriptions recorded in the deed and noticed another inconsistency. The planning documents displayed a public access route leading to the lakes, yet the recorded property documents never granted public access across my ranch. Someone had drawn an entrance on planning maps that no recorded legal document actually created. Michael immediately called the county planning office and requested confirmation. After several minutes on the phone, he ended the conversation with an expression I had not seen before. The planning department admitted they could locate no recorded approval establishing permanent public access to either lake. The maps showed it. The legal records did not. While we discussed the survey results, a tournament volunteer drove over in a utility vehicle and politely asked whether our equipment would interfere with the afternoon weigh-in because hundreds of spectators were expected to arrive within hours. His question reminded me that the championship was moving closer with every passing minute. I simply told him we would stay clear of the competitors. After he left, Michael quietly said, "These people honestly believe they belong here." That sentence stayed with me because it shifted my focus away from the participants and toward the people who had allowed the misunderstanding to continue for so many years. Just before noon, Ethan packed away his equipment but reached into another case and removed a faded field notebook that had belonged to the retired surveyor who trained him decades earlier. Flipping through the worn pages, he suddenly stopped at a handwritten entry dated almost 20 years before. The note mentioned both base lakes by name and included a single sentence that immediately caught Michael's attention. Developer advised that public lake access cannot begin until separate ownership agreement is completed. Michael read the sentence twice before looking back at me. "If this notebook reflects what the original surveyor documented," he said quietly, "then someone knew these lakes were never legally open to the public long before the first fishing tournament was ever held." The handwritten note in Ethan Collins's field notebook changed the direction of our investigation immediately because it suggested the problem had existed long before Rebecca Hayes or the current Homeowners Association board ever took control. Instead of returning to the lakes, Michael Turner drove us directly to the county records office where Laura Simmons, the senior records officer, agreed to help us search the original planning files. She greeted Michael by name and listened carefully as he explained the missing easement page, the conflicting maps, and the survey results. Rather than making assumptions, Laura requested every archived subdivision document connected to the development from nearly 20 years earlier. While county employees searched the storage room, she compared the digital records with the original indexing system. Within half an hour she discovered something neither Michael nor I had noticed. Several engineering reports referenced an attachment labeled Access Agreement Exhibit C, but every digital copy stopped one page before that attachment should have appeared. The index clearly proved the exhibit once existed, yet the document itself had vanished from both the electronic archive and the paper files stored in the county office. Laura quietly admitted she had never seen an archived exhibit disappear without some explanation. She immediately requested backup copies from the state records warehouse, warning us that retrieval could take time. While we waited, Michael reviewed another stack of engineering correspondence that Laura had located in a separate archive box. One letter from the original civil engineering firm immediately stood out. It advised the developer that weekend fishing events and public recreation should not begin until a separate ownership agreement for the lakes had been completed and officially recorded. Another memorandum estimated that constructing an independent public boat launch outside my property would cost significantly more than using the existing ranch entrance. Neither document accused anyone of wrongdoing, but together they revealed a clear pattern. The developer had known from the beginning that permanent public access still required additional legal work. Suddenly the current Homeowners Association looked less like the creator of the problem and more like the organization that inherited decades of incorrect assumptions. My understanding of Rebecca changed as well. She had confidently insisted the lakes belonged to the community because every board before hers had apparently operated under the same belief. That realization did not excuse using private property without permission, but it explained why nobody had questioned the arrangement for so many years. Before we could discuss the discovery further, Laura received a telephone call from the planning department. She placed the conversation on speaker without permission. The planning director confirmed that the county had reviewed Ethan's preliminary survey and wanted copies of every historical document we had collected before the championship weigh-in scheduled for the following afternoon. He explained that if the records supported our findings, the county might need to determine whether the tournament could legally continue while ownership questions remained unresolved. The countdown suddenly felt very real. Outside the records office, sponsor trucks continued arriving at the lakes while local radio stations promoted the championship as the biggest fishing event of the summer. Yet inside the county building, a completely different story was beginning to emerge. As we gathered our files to leave, Laura hurried back into the room holding a faded inventory sheet she had found tucked inside an old archive binder. She pointed to a handwritten notation beside Exhibit C and quietly said, "According to this inventory, the missing attachment was not a map. It was a signed agreement, and the signature that mattered most may never have been placed on the document at all." Less than 24 hours remained before the championship weigh-in, yet instead of returning to the ranch, Michael Turner insisted we deliver every certified document directly to the county planning department before rumors spread faster than the facts. The planning director met us in a conference room already covered with subdivision maps, engineering drawings, and recent aerial photographs. Ethan Collins carefully explained each survey measurement, while Laura Simmons presented the inventory sheet proving that Exhibit C had once existed as part of the original planning file. Nobody interrupted because every piece of evidence seemed to support the same conclusion. The planning director then opened another archive box that had recently been delivered from an off-site storage facility. Inside were engineering cost estimates prepared before the subdivision was ever built. One estimate immediately caught everyone's attention. It compared two options for future recreational access. The first proposed building an independent public entrance and boat launch outside my property. The second recommended temporarily using the existing ranch entrance until a permanent ownership agreement could be completed. The cost difference between the two options exceeded several $1 million in today's value. Suddenly the entire situation made far more sense. Saving money had been easier than resolving ownership. The planning director quietly admitted that if the temporary arrangement had never been converted into a legal agreement, every later assumption about public access rested on an unfinished plan instead of a completed approval. That was new information none of us expected. Before the meeting ended, county attorneys advised the planning department to begin an immediate internal review because the legal status of the lakes could directly affect the championship scheduled for the following afternoon. As we walked outside, local television crews had already started interviewing tournament participants about the upcoming finals. Nobody in those interviews had any idea that county officials were reviewing decades of planning history only a few hundred yards away. Driving back toward the ranch, I noticed even more campers, fishing boats, and sponsor trailers arriving than the previous day. The event had grown into a tradition for hundreds of families, making the truth even more difficult to accept. Rebecca Hayes happened to be directing volunteers near the registration tent when she saw my truck. Instead of confronting me, she calmly walked over and asked whether everything was ready for the championship. For the first time, I answered honestly. I told her county officials were reviewing historical property records and engineering documents because several important questions had never been fully resolved. Her confident expression slowly faded. She admitted she had served on the Homeowners Association board for nearly 8 years and had never once seen a deed proving the community owned the lakes. Every board meeting simply referred to them as community amenities because that was how they had always appeared in the planning materials. It was the first time I realized she might be discovering the truth at the same pace I was. Before either of us could continue, Michael received a telephone call from Laura. The State Records Warehouse had located a sealed copy of the missing Exhibit C, but she warned us there was something unusual about it. According to the inventory description, the agreement contained signature blocks for 3 separate property owners, yet the warehouse staff immediately noticed that one signature line appeared to have remained completely blank. The call from Laura Simmons came just after sunrise on the morning of the championship, and I could hear the urgency in her voice before she even finished introducing herself. The sealed copy of Exhibit C had arrived from the State Records Warehouse overnight, and county attorneys wanted everyone involved to review it before making any decision that could affect hundreds of people already gathering around the lakes. Michael Turner picked me up on the way to the courthouse, and neither of us said much during the drive because the answer we had been chasing for days was finally sitting inside a single envelope. When we arrived, Laura carefully placed the original document on the conference table beside the certified deed, Ethan Collins's survey, and the engineering correspondence we had already collected. She broke the archival seal while everyone watched. The agreement itself was remarkably simple. It proposed temporary public use of the lakes until a permanent ownership agreement could be negotiated between the developer and the surrounding landowners. 3 signature blocks appeared on the final page. The developer had signed. A county representative had signed. The third signature, reserved for the owner of the ranch, remained completely blank. My uncle's name had been typed beneath the line, but no signature had ever been placed there. Michael quietly looked at the county attorney and asked the only question that mattered. Without the property owner's signature, was this agreement ever completed? The attorney slowly shook her head. No. It was drafted, partially executed, and apparently treated as though it had become final, but legally this document never became an effective agreement. The room fell silent because everyone immediately understood what that meant. For nearly 2 decades, planning maps, community brochures, and annual tournament schedules had all relied upon an agreement that had never actually existed. Ethan then compared the unsigned exhibit with his survey and confirmed once again that the boat ramps, parking areas, and shoreline improvements depended entirely upon access across my private land. The planning director thanked him before announcing that the county could not ignore the original records any longer. He immediately instructed staff to suspend authorization for the championship weigh-in until legal counsel completed an emergency review. News of the decision spread quickly through the administration building, but outside, tournament participants continued launching boats because they had not yet heard what was happening. Rebecca Hayes arrived only minutes later after receiving a phone call from the planning department. She looked at the unsigned agreement for several long moments before quietly admitting that no Homeowners Association board member had ever been shown the original document. Every president before her had simply inherited binders describing the lakes as community amenities. She apologized for insisting the property belonged to the association without verifying the legal records herself. I appreciated her honesty because it confirmed what had become increasingly clear. The biggest mistake had not been created by one person. It had grown over many years as assumptions replaced documentation. Just as the meeting appeared to be ending, the county attorney received an electronic message from the commissioner's office. After reading it, she looked up and announced that because the issue affected both private property rights and future subdivision approvals, the commissioners were ordering a formal public hearing within the week, and every historical record, every survey, and every witness connected to the lakes would become part of the official record before a final decision could be made. I spent the next several days preparing for the county hearing instead of celebrating what many people assumed was already a victory. Michael Turner reminded me that discovering the truth and proving it through an official process were 2 very different things. Every document had to be certified. Every survey measurement had to be verified. Every timeline had to match the historical record without exaggeration. Ethan Collins finalized his survey with precise coordinates showing that the boat ramps, parking areas, and shoreline improvements had all been constructed on property protected by my deed. Laura Simmons assembled certified copies of the archived planning files, the engineering correspondence, the inventory sheet referencing Exhibit C, and the unsigned agreement recovered from the state warehouse. By the morning of the hearing, several thick binders sat neatly organized across the conference table. Outside the county administration building, the atmosphere felt completely different from the excitement surrounding the fishing tournament only a few days earlier. Homeowners, local business owners, reporters, anglers, and county employees filled nearly every seat inside the hearing room. Many residents appeared confused because they had believed for years that the lakes belonged to the community. Others seemed concerned about what would happen if public access disappeared completely. I understood both reactions because I had never wanted to punish families who simply trusted the information they had been given. When the commissioners called the meeting to order, the county attorney carefully summarized the issue without assigning blame. She explained that newly discovered historical records required the county to determine whether public access had ever been legally established. Michael presented our evidence in chronological order rather than emotionally. He began with the certified deed showing uninterrupted private ownership of the ranch and both lakes. Ethan followed by explaining the survey results, demonstrating how every tournament facility depended upon crossing my private entrance. Laura then described the missing Exhibit C, the archived inventory sheet, and the unsigned agreement recovered from the state warehouse. Each witness answered questions calmly, relying only upon documents already entered into the official record. When Rebecca Hayes addressed the commissioners, she surprised almost everyone in the room. Instead of arguing against the evidence, she admitted that every Homeowners Association board she had served with relied on planning maps and inherited files without ever requesting the original ownership records. She apologized publicly for asserting authority she believed existed but had never independently verified. Her statement changed the tone of the hearing immediately because the discussion shifted away from personal accusations and toward correcting a long-standing administrative mistake. Several longtime residents also testified that they had honestly believed the lakes were community property because tournaments had been held there for nearly 2 decades. Their comments reinforced the same conclusion. Assumptions had gradually replaced documentation until nobody questioned the foundation beneath them. After several hours of testimony, the commissioners recessed to review the certified exhibits in private. The hearing room became almost silent as everyone waited. Nearly 40 minutes later, the commissioners returned, and the chairperson announced that the county had reached a preliminary conclusion based upon the historical evidence presented. The unsigned agreement, the recorded deed, and the certified survey all pointed toward the same legal reality. However, before issuing the final order, the commissioners intended to read one additional document that had arrived from the original developer's legal files only that morning, believing it might finally explain why the unfinished agreement had remained unresolved for nearly 20 years. The hearing resumed after the commissioners returned to the bench, and the chairperson explained that the newly discovered document had been recovered from the legal archive of the original development company after attorneys completed an additional records search that morning. A certified copy was handed to every commissioner, to Michael Turner, and to the county attorney before anyone spoke another word. The document was a formal letter written by the developer's legal counsel almost 20 years earlier. It confirmed that negotiations with my uncle had failed because he refused to transfer ownership rights or grant permanent public access across the ranch without a separate purchase agreement. The letter further instructed the developer that no advertising, community publications, or planning materials should describe the lakes as public amenities until a final agreement had been executed and recorded. Reading those words in the hearing room completely changed the remaining discussion because they removed the last unanswered question. The unfinished agreement had never been forgotten. It had simply never been completed. Somewhere along the way, temporary planning assumptions gradually became accepted as permanent facts. The commissioners asked Laura Simmons whether any later document contradicted the developer's legal instructions. She answered that her office had searched every available archive and found nothing changing the ownership recorded in the deed. Ethan Collins confirmed that every modern survey still matched the original legal boundary monuments placed decades earlier. Michael then reminded the commissioners that the issue before them was not whether the community had enjoyed the lakes for many years but whether the county possessed any legal authority to authorize continued access across private property without a recorded easement. The county attorney answered that question directly. She stated that no such authority appeared anywhere in the certified record. Rebecca Hayes requested permission to address the commissioners one final time. Standing before the room, she acknowledged that the Homeowners Association had relied upon planning maps, inherited board records, and long-standing custom instead of verified legal documents. She expressed regret for asserting ownership that the association could not prove and stated that the board would cooperate fully with whatever lawful process followed. Her statement was met with quiet respect because it reflected accountability rather than argument. Several residents also spoke briefly, explaining that while they were disappointed to learn the truth, they appreciated finally understanding how the misunderstanding had developed over so many years. The commissioners thanked everyone for remaining respectful throughout the proceedings before announcing their formal findings. They concluded that ownership of the ranch and both base lakes had remained private without interruption, that no recorded easement authorized public access through the ranch entrance, and that the unsigned agreement carried no legal effect because the property owner's approval had never been obtained. They further directed county staff to begin correcting planning maps and administrative records so future documents accurately reflected the legal status of the property. At the same time, they encouraged the Homeowners Association and me to discuss any future access only through voluntary agreements that respected private property rights and applicable county procedures. As people slowly gathered their papers and prepared to leave, the chairperson mentioned one final administrative matter. Because inaccurate planning documents had remained in circulation for nearly 2 decades, the county intended to complete an internal review to determine exactly how the incorrect designation had continued appearing in official materials for so many years, and the results of that review would be presented publicly at the commissioners' next scheduled meeting. Several weeks passed after the hearing before the county completed its internal review, and by then the atmosphere around the ranch had changed completely. The temporary tournament signs had disappeared, the registration tents were gone, and the long lines of trucks pulling fishing boats no longer crossed my private entrance every weekend. Instead, county survey crews installed updated boundary markers while planning officials corrected maps that had incorrectly identified the lakes as community recreation areas for nearly 2 decades. The commissioners later released the results of their administrative review during a public meeting. Their report concluded that no evidence suggested anyone had intentionally transferred ownership away from my family. Instead, the county determined that an unfinished planning proposal had gradually been copied from one document to another until temporary assumptions appeared permanent. Once those planning materials spread through engineering files, promotional brochures, and Homeowners Association records, each new board accepted them without requesting the original legal documents. The mistake had grown through repetition rather than verification. Hearing that conclusion gave me a sense of closure because it confirmed what the evidence had shown from the very beginning. The law had never changed. Only the paperwork people relied upon had changed. Rebecca Hayes later asked whether we could meet at the ranch one final time. She arrived without attorneys or board members, carrying only a folder containing updated Homeowners Association records. She explained that the association had already begun correcting every handbook, neighborhood map, and welcome packet distributed to future homeowners so no family would inherit the same misunderstanding again. She also apologized once more for telling me that permission had never been necessary. I told her I appreciated the apology because I now understood she had trusted the same incorrect records everyone else had trusted. We spent the next hour discussing a possibility that would have seemed impossible when we first met beside the crowded tournament registration tent. Rather than arguing about ownership, we talked about cooperation. Michael Turner later helped draft a simple framework allowing the Homeowners Association to request limited access for specific community events in the future only through written permission, insurance requirements, scheduling agreements, and clear respect for private property boundaries. Nothing would occur automatically again. Every future event would exist because both sides voluntarily agreed, not because someone assumed permission already existed. A few months later, a much smaller youth fishing day took place at one of the lakes under that new agreement. Families arrived through the approved entrance, volunteers followed every condition exactly as written, and when the event ended, the property looked exactly as it had before everyone arrived. Watching children learn to fish while knowing my family's property rights remained fully protected reminded me that the real victory had never been about preventing people from enjoying the lakes. It had been about restoring honesty to the process. Looking back, I often think about the moment Rebecca confidently told me the Homeowners Association had never needed anyone's permission. At the time, those words sounded like certainty. In reality, they reflected years of assumptions built upon incomplete records. The truth did not emerge because anyone shouted louder or demanded more authority. It emerged because certified deeds, original surveys, engineering notes, archived correspondence, and careful legal procedure all pointed toward the same conclusion. I inherited 2 beautiful base lakes, but the most valuable thing I ultimately protected was something far less visible. I protected the principle that property rights do not disappear through tradition, convenience, or repetition. They endure because the law preserves them until the rightful owner chooses otherwise, and in the end, that quiet truth accomplished what years of mistaken assumptions never could.